Hi everybody, this is Alexandre White-Brown here again today with a second video that I'm putting together for the Shine Syndrome Foundation. I just wanted to start off today's video by mentioning that none of the information provided in these videos should replace the medical advice of your medical geneticist or any doctors that you may be seeing. These videos are solely meant to provide some basic information with regards to Shine Syndrome, the DLG4 gene, and some of the mechanisms surrounding this condition. So in the last video, I discussed a little bit about the DLG4 gene as a whole, how it functions, a little bit about the inheritance, and today I really want to focus on the protein that is produced by the DLG4 gene known as PSD95 or postsynaptic density 95. So I thought something really important to start off today's video will be to discuss how we go from the gene all the way down to the protein. So what I did is I put a little diagram here that goes through how that process works. And we call that the central dogma. And that might have been something that some of you might have heard in the past. But essentially how it works is we have our DNA strand here with the gene. And if we think of this part here as the gene, that would be our DLG4 gene. That DLG4 gene is read by this RNA. So we go from the gene, the DLG4 gene, to the RNA. The RNA then codes for a specific protein. So it has a specific code that it reads from the DNA to create the polypeptides that are strung together to make the PSD95 protein. Now, the PSD95 protein is an extremely important protein in the brain and in the human body. And this is because the PSD95 protein interacts and organizes so many other proteins in the brain and in brain cells, which are called neurons, and therefore its organizational components and its mechanisms are extremely important for making sure that a lot of other proteins work and flow in a way that is beneficial for the neurons. So this little diagram here gives a little bit of an example of how this looks. In the previous video, I had mentioned that PSD95 is really important in synapses. So these synapses are what we find at the end of neurons that allow them to communicate with each other. And we know that communication of neurons, of brain cells between each other, is extremely important for allowing the brain to function and develop in the way that it should. So if we think of this in a metaphor, sometimes you can think of it as maybe a car or a bicycle. There are many functioning parts and many different parts to a bicycle or a car, but sometimes without a specific part, the other parts can't really function. For example, with a bike, if you didn't have gears, it might still function, but it might not function as well as it can. And the PSD95 protein is very similar to an engine in a car or the gears on a bike. It really helps to organize and bring those other parts together to help the overall protein in the synapses do what they're supposed to do. So if we think of PSD95 here as maybe the triangle here, it is helping to bring all of these different proteins together to help this synapse, which would be at the end of a neuron, communicate with this synapse here. And the reason this is so important is because the communication between these neurons is extremely important in how we facilitate memory, learning, and how our brain develops. Two types of sayings that you might have heard before might be synaptic plasticity and synaptic pruning. So synaptic plasticity is the idea that something can grow and change and adapt. So when we're growing up and we're developing and we're, let's say, learning how to speak or learning how to walk, we are building stronger connections between neurons. The connection between these synapses becomes stronger and more efficient, and this allows us to learn, it allows us to facilitate memory, and it allows us to have our brain and our neurons develop more and more so that we start to develop more skills, such as speech, such as walking, riding a bike, etc. So if the communication between synapses, between neurons in the brain is not able to function and becomes dysfunctional, this may inhibit our ability to properly learn, to properly facilitate memory, and this can have an overall impact on how we ourselves and our brains develop. So if you can think of, if we have a genetic change in the gene from here that doesn't allow the RNA to code properly for this PSD95 protein, what we're left with is either a smaller protein, less of the protein, or perhaps a dysfunctional protein. And this means that at the synapse level, so at that communication level, a child or a patient with a mutation in the DLG4 gene might be at a disadvantage of being able to strengthen and have more efficient connections between neurons. And this can have a very big impact on how the brain develops, how it communicates, and overall learning and memory development. There's a paper that was recently put out by one of the DLG4 and Shine syndrome champions, Dr. Zainab Toomer, and one of her students, postdoctoral fellows, Amanda. It's very, very interesting and goes very much in depth about the PSD95 protein. And for those of you that want to get more about the science background and the details on the PSD95 protein, I'd really encourage you to go check that out. It is available, a link on the website, so shinesyndrome.org, if you'd like to go check that out. That's all the detail that I'm going to go into today for the PSD95 protein. But once again, if anybody has any questions, I wouldn't hesitate to reach out. I'm happy to take any more questions and go into more detail if there's those who are interested. In the next video, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what the different types of variants look like from the gene level. So some you might have heard of a missense or frame shift mutations and variants, and how those impact the RNA and how that ends up impacting the PSD95 protein. And that will go into a little bit more detail about how that affects these synapses and communication between neurons in the brain. Thank you so much for listening today, and we'll be talking to you again.